History isn't just about heroes and inventions. It's about nightmares that actually happened. Real deaths, real terror. These aren't stories made up to scare you. These are the true horrors we lived through. This article walks you through 10 chilling real-life, historical events that left scars on humanity's collective memory. Each one is a reminder of what people have done and what people are capable of. Chapter 1, The Dancing Plague, of 1518, when people danced themselves to death. In July 1518, the streets of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, now France, became the stage for one of the most bizarre and terrifying phenomena in European history, the dancing plague. It began when a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into the street and began to dance. She danced for hours, seemingly unable to stop. Onlookers were puzzled. But what started as one woman's strange episode quickly turned into a collective nightmare. Within a week, dozens of people had joined her. They danced without rest, some until their feet bled. A few days later, the number rose to hundreds. City officials, unsure of what to do, called in physicians. The diagnosis? Hot blood. Their solution? Let them keep dancing, hoping it would burn out the sickness. But the dancing didn't stop. People collapsed from exhaustion. Some suffered strokes and heart attacks. Others simply dropped dead in the street. The strange mania lasted for over a month. Records from the time suggest as many as 400 people were affected, and several dozen may have died. To this day, no one truly knows what caused the dancing plague. Theories range from mass psychogenic illness, mass hysteria, to ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold that grows on damp rye and can cause convulsions and delusions. But there is no clear answer. What makes the dancing plague so chilling isn't just the deaths, it's the mystery. These weren't people celebrating or performing. They were trapped in their own bodies, terrified and unable to stop. It's one of the most haunting examples of mass hysteria in human history, and the fact that it remains unexplained makes it even scarier. Chapter 2, Unit 731, Japan's Secret Lab of Horror. In the icy region of Harbin, Manchuria, during the 1930s and early 1940s, the Japanese Imperial Army established a top-secret research unit that would go on to commit some of the most horrifying atrocities ever documented. It was called Unit 731, and its existence was hidden for decades. Officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, Unit 731 was anything but benign. It was, in reality, a biological and chemical warfare research facility, where human beings were used as live test subjects in cruel and inhumane experiments. Most of the victims were Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, but Koreans, Russians, and even some Allied POWs were also subjected to unspeakable horrors. The scientists and doctors involved referred to the victims as logs, dehumanizing them to justify the atrocities they committed. It's estimated that between 3,000 to 12,000 people died within Unit 731's walls, but the death toll may be even higher, especially when you count the civilians affected by the experiments released in the field. What happened inside the facility is the stuff of nightmares. Victims were vivisected alive, cut open without anesthesia to observe the progression of disease, injected with plague bacteria to monitor how quickly they would die, frozen in extreme cold to study frostbite, and then thawed with boiling water, subjected to rape, forced pregnancies, and testing of sexually transmitted diseases, strapped into pressure chambers until their eyeballs exploded, fed poisoned food or exposed to deadly gases to measure survival rates. In one experiment, prisoners were tied to stakes at various distances from a grenade, blast to determine the effects of shrapnel and blast waves. In others, subjects were injected with animal blood, seawater, or exposed to radiation poisoning. Perhaps the most chilling part? After World War II ended, the world didn't immediately learn about Unit 731. In fact, many of the key scientists involved, including General Shiro Ishii, were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research data on biological warfare. Unlike the Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, the perpetrators of Unit 731's atrocities were never tried or punished. Many went on to hold prominent positions in Japanese medicine and industry. The Japanese government did not officially acknowledge Unit 731's existence for decades. Survivors, families of victims, and human rights activists have pushed for recognition and justice. But to this day, very few reparations have been made. The fact that Unit 731 existed, not in the Middle Ages but in the modern era, under the watch of doctors and scientists who took oaths to protect life, is what makes it so terrifying. It serves as a reminder of how scientific progress, when untethered from morality, can become a tool of unimaginable evil. Chapter 3, The Great Fire of London, a city consumed by flames. In the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, the city of London was fast asleep. The streets were narrow, buildings tightly packed, and most of the structures were made entirely of wood. It had been a long, dry summer, and the medieval city was a tinderbox waiting to ignite. That ignition came just after midnight, in a bakery on Pudding Lane. A spark caught flame in Thomas Farriner's oven, and soon, the fire spread beyond the bakery, racing through the city like a living monster. At first, the fire seemed controllable. Fires were not uncommon in a city made of timber and thatch. But on this night, a perfect storm of strong winds, dry air, and delayed response turned a simple house fire into one of the most terrifying urban disasters in history. The fire leaped from roof to roof, house to house. By the morning, entire blocks were engulfed. People fled their homes in panic, many grabbing what they could carry, some abandoning everything. Cries, chaos, and choking smoke filled the air. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, infamously dismissed the threat, saying a woman might piss it out. That decision to delay aggressive action would haunt the city for generations. Over the next 4 days, the fire tore through the heart of London. Landmarks including St. Paul's Cathedral, 87 churches, and 13,000 homes were destroyed. The sky was black with smoke, and the flames lit the night like a second sun. People thought the end of the world had come. Religious hysteria spread, with many believing it was divine punishment. Others blamed foreigners or Catholic conspiracies. Mob violence broke out, adding to the horror. Miraculously, only a handful of official deaths were recorded, but modern historians believe the actual toll was higher, especially among the poor and undocumented, who likely perished and were burned beyond recognition. When the fire was finally extinguished, over 80% of London's inner city lay in ruins. The city had to be completely redesigned and rebuilt. Sir Christopher Wren led the efforts, and his version of St. Paul's Cathedral, completed decades later, stands as a symbol of that rebirth. But the psychological scars ran deep. For years, Londoners lived in fear of fire, and the Great Fire became a defining trauma of the city's identity. What makes the Great Fire of London so frightening isn't just the scale of destruction, it's how sudden, uncontrollable, and overwhelming it was. In just a few days, one of the largest cities in the world was brought to its knees by a single flame. It's a lesson in how fragile even the most powerful civilizations can be when nature and human error collide. Chapter 4. The Jonestown Massacre, a cult's deadly end. In November 1978, a tragedy unfolded deep in the jungle of Guyana that would shock the world. Over 900 people, men, women, and children, died in a single day, not from war or natural disaster, but by their own hands, under the influence of a charismatic and dangerous cult leader named Jim Jones. This wasn't fiction, this was Jonestown. Jim Jones began as a preacher in Indiana in the 1950s, forming the People's Temple, a religious movement promising racial equality, community, and social justice. To many, especially African Americans and those disillusioned with society, Jones seemed like a beacon of hope. He welcomed outcasts, provided meals, offered housing, and fought segregation. But beneath his image as a progressive activist was a deeply paranoid and controlling man. Jones believed in absolute loyalty, staged fake miracles, bugged his followers' homes, and punished dissenters. By the mid-1970s, he had moved his followers to California, then convinced hundreds to follow him to a so-called utopia in Guyana. What awaited the followers in the Guyanese jungle was anything but paradise. Jonestown was a heavily guarded, isolated compound. Members worked long hours, endured constant surveillance, and were subjected to white nights, rehearsals for mass suicide. Dissenters were shamed, drugged, or imprisoned. Back in the US, relatives and defectors raised alarms. Congressman Leo Ryan flew to Jonestown, with journalists and observers to investigate. On November 18, 1978, after a tense visit, several Jonestown residents asked Ryan to help them escape. As Ryan and the defectors prepared to leave from a nearby airstrip, Jones ordered their murder. Gunmen ambushed them, killing 5 people, including Congressman Ryan, the only sitting US congressman ever killed in the line of duty. Back in Jonestown, Jones gathered his followers in the pavilion and declared that the end had come. He called it a revolutionary act. A vat of cyanide-laced flavor aid was prepared. Parents were ordered to give it to their children first. Then adults drank. Some were forced. Some believed they were doing the right thing. Others tried to flee, only to be shot by guards. In the end, 918 people died, including 304 children. The Jonestown Massacre is terrifying because it shows how charisma, manipulation, isolation, and fear can push ordinary people to commit unthinkable acts. These were not monsters or villains. They were everyday people who fell into the hands of someone who weaponized belief. To this day, drinking the Kool-Aid is a phrase used to describe blind loyalty, but it's a dark phrase, born from one of the most horrifying cult tragedies in modern history. Chapter 5. The Chernobyl Disaster. The explosion that poisoned a nation. On April 26, 1986, at exactly 1:23 a.m., a massive explosion rocked reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Pripyat, Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. What followed was the worst nuclear disaster in human history, a terrifying event that continues to haunt the world. During a late-night safety test, engineers at Chernobyl shut off critical control systems to simulate a power outage. Due to a combination of poor reactor design, human error, and political pressure, the reactor became unstable. A sudden spike in power led to a steam explosion, tearing through the reactor and blowing the 1,000-ton steel lid off like a toy. Seconds later, a second, even more powerful explosion launched radioactive debris into the atmosphere. Flames and glowing graphite littered the site. The reactor core was exposed, spewing lethal radiation into the night sky. Soviet authorities delayed telling the public. Residents of nearby Pripyat, just 2 miles away, went about their day, unaware they were being bathed in deadly radiation. Children played outside, families had picnics. All the while, radiation levels were thousands of times above normal. Only 36 hours later were the 49,000 residents evacuated. But by then, the damage was done. Meanwhile, thousands of workers, known as liquidators, were sent to contain the disaster. These brave men, many of them soldiers, firefighters and engineers, worked in shifts of mere seconds to minutes on the reactor roof, shoveling radioactive debris by hand, knowing they were walking into death. Helicopters dropped sand, lead, and boron onto the reactor to try and smother the fire. A concrete sarcophagus was eventually built to seal the core, but by then, Radiation had already spread across Europe. The Soviet government claimed only 31 official deaths, but the real toll is far higher. Thousands have died from radiation sickness and cancer over the decades. Children in Belarus and Ukraine suffered birth defects and thyroid cancers. Forests near the site turned red from radiation, now known as the Red Forest, one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Even today, wildlife in the area shows signs of mutation. Pripyat remains a ghost city, frozen in time. Dolls, schoolbooks, and Ferris wheels sit untouched in the silence of nuclear fallout. Chernobyl was not just a Soviet tragedy, it was a global warning. It exposed the dangers of nuclear energy when paired with secrecy, negligence, and a lack of accountability. It shattered the illusion that science alone could control nature. The psychological impact was immense. Trust in government collapsed. Fear of invisible death gripped populations. The event remains a cautionary tale about how a moment's mistake can poison generations. Chapter 6. The Black Death, the plague that wiped out half of Europe. In the mid-14th century, an invisible killer swept across continents, leaving piles of corpses and ghost towns in its wake. Known as the Black Death, the bubonic plague wasn't just a health crisis, it was a cataclysm that upended the entire structure of medieval life. Between 1347 and 1351, it is estimated that 50 to 60% of Europe's population perished, roughly 25 to 50 million people in just a few years. The plague likely originated in Central Asia, possibly around Mongolia. It traveled along the Silk Road, carried by fleas living on rats. These rats hitched rides on merchant ships and caravans, unknowingly bringing doom to every port and city they touched. The plague first reached Europe through the port of Messina, Sicily, in 1347. From there, it spread like wildfire. Once infected, victims experienced symptoms so horrifying they seemed supernatural. Painful buboes, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, neck, and armpits. High fevers, chills, vomiting, and diarrhea. Blackened skin from internal bleeding, hence Black Death. Death within 2 to 5 days. Entire families died within days. Whole towns were wiped out. Corpses littered the streets, unburied and rotting. Graves were dug in mass, stacked high with the dead. In some places, the stench was so unbearable that people fled cities entirely. As the death toll rose, society began to crumble. Priests stopped performing last rites. Doctors fled their posts, and neighbors abandoned each other. Fear was so great that many locked themselves indoors, hoping to escape the bad air. Religious fanatics known as flagellants roamed the streets, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, believing the plague was God's punishment for sin. Others blamed Jews, resulting in horrific pogroms where Jewish communities were massacred or burned alive. The Black Death changed the world. Labor shortages gave peasants more bargaining power, leading to the slow collapse of feudalism. The Catholic Church's credibility suffered. Art and literature took on darker, more morbid themes. Medical science began evolving beyond superstition. But for those who lived through it, the memory never faded. The Black Death wasn't just a disease, it was apocalypse made real. A time when death seemed to fall from the sky, touch your skin, and kill you by nightfall. Chapter 7. The Salem Witch Trials, Fear, Hysteria, and the Execution of Innocents. In the winter of 1692, in the small Puritan town of Salem, Massachusetts, a wave of paranoia swept through the community like wildfire. Within months, more than 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft, and 20 were executed, most of them by hanging. One man was pressed to death with stones. It was one of the most terrifying episodes of mass hysteria in American history. It began with 2 young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, the daughter and niece of Reverend Samuel Paris. They began to exhibit strange, violent fits, screaming, contorting, babbling nonsense. The local doctor, unable to find a physical cause, suggested something sinister: witchcraft. Soon, other girls began to display similar symptoms. The afflicted accused 3 women, Tituba, a Caribbean slave, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, of bewitching them. All 3 were outcasts in Puritan society, making them perfect scapegoats. Tituba, under pressure, confessed and told wild stories of black dogs, red cats, and signing the devil's book. Her confession legitimized the panic, and the witch hunt began. As fear spread, neighbor turned on neighbor. Accusations flew. People who had lived peacefully side by side for decades suddenly became enemies. The accused were often those who were poor, eccentric, or had spoken out against authority. The trials were filled with spectral evidence, claims of seeing the accused in dreams or visions. The court accepted these visions as fact. One of the most tragic cases was that of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old man who refused to plead guilty or innocent. To force a plea, he was crushed to death with heavy stones, his last words reportedly being, "More weight." 19 people were hanged on Gallows Hill, and 1 was pressed to death. Several others died in jail. The youngest accused was just 4 years old. Eventually, the hysteria died down. Governor William Phipps, alarmed by the chaos, dissolved the special court and banned the use of spectral evidence. In time, the Massachusetts colony apologized and paid restitution to the victims' families, but the damage was already done. The Salem witch trials are terrifying not just because of the deaths, but because they show how fear, religion, and superstition can override justice and humanity. Rationality was replaced by mass panic, and due process was thrown aside for mob rule. It's a chilling example of how a community can self-destruct when fear is allowed to dominate truth. The echoes of Salem still resonate today, as a warning of what happens when suspicion is given more weight than evidence. Chapter 8. The Dancing Plague of 1518, when hundreds danced to death. In the summer of 1518, In the city of Strasbourg, now part of modern-day France, something deeply bizarre and terrifying occurred. People began dancing uncontrollably in the streets, not for celebration or joy, but in what appeared to be a trance-like state. And they didn't stop. Over the course of several weeks, hundreds joined in. Many danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, and some reportedly danced themselves to death. In July 1518, a woman known as Frau Trophea walked out into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no festival, no reason. She danced for hours, then came back the next day and kept dancing. Within a week, dozens had joined her. By the end of the month, the number had risen to 400. They danced day and night. Many screamed in pain as their feet bled. Some begged for help but couldn't stop. Others foamed at the mouth, collapsed, and died from heart attacks, strokes, or exhaustion. Local officials and clergy were horrified, but baffled. Their response? They believed it was a natural illness, and that the dancers would recover if they just danced it out. So they built stages, and even hired musicians to accompany the dancers, hoping it would release the fever. But this only made it worse. More people joined. The dancing intensified. It wasn't until the death toll began to rise that officials realized something was very, very wrong. Eventually, the dancers were carted off to a shrine in the mountains, where priests performed exorcisms and healing rituals. Slowly, the plague stopped. To this day, no one knows exactly what caused the dancing plague. Theories include mass hysteria triggered by extreme stress and starvation. The region had recently experienced famine, disease, and political unrest. Ergot poisoning, a toxic mold on rye bread that causes hallucinations. The same substance behind LSD. Psychogenic illness, where trauma manifests as physical symptoms in groups. Whatever the cause, this wasn't an isolated event. Similar dancing manias occurred throughout medieval Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries, but none were as large or deadly as what happened in Strasbourg. The dancing plague is one of the most surreal and haunting events in history, because it blurs the line between body and mind, between faith and fear. That people could lose all control over their actions and be watched as they died slowly in public is a terrifying reminder of how fragile the human psyche can be. It challenges our sense of autonomy. If a whole city could be swept up into madness, who's to say it couldn't happen again? Chapter 9, Unit 731, Japan's Secret Laboratory of Horror. During World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army operated a covert facility so horrific, it rivals the worst war crimes in history, known as Unit 731. It was hidden in plain sight in Harbin, Manchuria, northeastern China, and disguised as a water purification unit. In reality, it was a biological and chemical warfare research center where doctors tortured and experimented on live human beings without anesthesia, mercy, or accountability. What happened there remained a closely guarded secret for decades, but the truth is now undeniable, and it's among the most terrifying events ever orchestrated by a government. Unit 731 was run by General Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist with a twisted vision of Japan, dominating the world through germ warfare. Under his leadership, Unit 731 committed atrocities that defy belief. Victims were called logs by researchers, dehumanizing them. Even in official records, they included Chinese civilians, Koreans, Russians, and even American and Allied POWs. What they endured is the stuff of nightmares, vivisections. Prisoners were dissected alive, without anesthesia to observe the effects of disease on living organs. Some were infected with plague or syphilis before being cut open. Frostbite tests, limbs, were frozen and then smashed with hammers to study tissue decay. Bioweapon trials. Victims were intentionally infected with anthrax, cholera, and typhus to measure infection rates and kill times. Weapon testing, grenades, flamethrowers, and chemical agents were used on prisoners at close range. Rape and forced pregnancy. Women were impregnated against their will to test transmission of diseases from mother to child. All of this was done in the name of science and wartime research. It's estimated that at least 3,000 people died inside Unit 731's facilities, but the total number of victims, including those affected by biological attacks across China, may be in the hundreds of thousands. Entire villages were wiped out by plague bombs dropped from airplanes. Wells were poisoned. Children were deliberately infected and watched as they died. After Japan's surrender in 1945, you might expect the architects of Unit 731 to be prosecuted like the Nazis at Nuremberg. In exchange for access to their research, the US government granted immunity to General Ishii and his staff. Their data, gathered through torture and death, was seen as too valuable to lose to the Soviets. Ishii lived a quiet life in Japan, dying in 1959 without ever facing justice. To this day, many Japanese textbooks omit or minimize Unit 731's crimes, and the victims' families are still waiting for official acknowledgement and apology. Unit 731 represents the darkest possible abuse of science, medicine, and power. It shows how people in lab coats, people sworn to heal, can become monsters when ideology and ambition override morality. Chapter 10. The Great Smog of London. The killer, fog no one saw coming. In early December 1952, London experienced a catastrophe that felt like something out of a horror film, but it was terrifyingly real. For 5 days, the city was suffocated under a thick, yellowish fog so dense and toxic it stopped traffic, blinded pedestrians, and most horrifyingly, killed over 12,000 people. This wasn't just bad weather. This was the Great Smog of London, one of the deadliest environmental disasters in recorded history. London had long been known for fog, but this was something different. A cold weather snap in December 1952 led residents to burn more coal than usual. The problem? Londoners mostly used low-grade sulfurous coal, which emitted thick, sooty smoke. Meanwhile, power stations were operating at full capacity, spewing more pollution into the air. Then came a temperature inversion, a meteorological event where warm air traps cold air and everything in it near the ground. The smoke, soot, sulfur dioxide, and other pollutants had nowhere to go. By December 5th, a poisonous cloud blanketed the city, and it didn't lift until December 9th. The smog was so thick people couldn't see their feet. Buses stopped running. Boats on the Thames were grounded. Even indoor events were canceled because the smog seeped into buildings. People coughed violently. Some collapsed in the streets. Hospitals filled with patients gasping for air. At first, no one realized just how dangerous the smog was. But as the days dragged on, the death toll mounted, mostly from respiratory failure and infections. Elderly citizens, children, and people with pre-existing conditions were the most vulnerable. By the time it cleared, 4,000 people had died, and in the weeks that followed, an additional 8,000 succumbed to complications. The smog was a turning point in environmental awareness. Public outcry forced the British government to act, leading to the Clean Air Act of 1956, which restricted the burning of coal in urban areas and introduced smokeless zones. It also marked a realization: the air we breathe can kill us. Not in some distant future, but right now, silently, invisibly. The Great Smog didn't come with sirens or explosions. It came quietly, with every breath. It reminded the world that we shape our environment, and that when we pollute it, it can turn against us, swiftly and lethally. No monsters, no war. Just the invisible hand of human carelessness, slowly tightening around the throat of a city. These 10 historical events show that the world doesn't need ghosts or creatures to frighten us. The most terrifying moments in history are often rooted in truth. Human mistakes, mass hysteria, unchecked power, and nature's wrath. Whether it's a plague that wipes out half a continent, a government experiment on its own people, or a fog that silently kills thousands, each event carries the same underlying fear. We are vulnerable, and sometimes we are the cause.